Moving on to exchange rates, the assumption underlying our global forecasts are that, again, assuming that EU policymakers restore confidence in monetary union, that the euro will still weaken. Well, the euro will still weaken, but will weaken somewhat less against the dollar this year. The yen, on the other hand, will be supported by Japanese institutional investors' home buyers, but the declining domestic savings rate is going to make it vulnerable in the medium term. Emerging market currencies will continue to be supported by the wide interest rate and growth differentials with OECD economies. And with respect to the rand specifically, you can expect further gradual depreciation this year due to indirect action by the Reserve Bank, which we've already mentioned this morning. This is by building forex reserves and liberalizing exchange controls. The other factor there is investors' recalibration of risk. That's global investors. Fairly high inflation, the current account deficit, as well as uncertainty leading up to the next election in 2014, will see the rand weaken further. So we expect it to drift down to 9.5 rand to the dollar by 2015. Of course, the usual caveats about exogenous shocks or unexpected policy changes apply. With respect to interest rates and inflation, very little to say on this front, really. We don't expect the US Federal Reserve to raise its policy rate until the third quarter of 2012. We expect the first interest rate rise by the European Central Bank to happen only in the first quarter of 2012. And Japanese policy rates will be held at emergency levels until late 2012. The labour market. This is the ILO official definition of unemployment. That excludes anyone that is not actively seeking work. With overall unemployment at 25%, the disparity between the population groups is a chilling reminder of the legacy that the country is still fighting to put to rest. In terms of the distribution of earnings, this is wages by sector and by employment. And as you can see, it's really a shame that so few people work in the electricity sector. It looks like that's really where you want to be. Having said that, remember that these are average wages, so it's simply total earnings paid to personnel, including part-time and full-time workers, in that sector, divided by the number of people employed on both a part-time and full-time basis. However, it does give quite an interesting indication of the distribution of employment by sector and average wages, assuming that the same sort of gaps or differentials apply between sort of workers and top management in each sector, which may not be the case, of course. Moving on to the distribution of earnings, again, we have come a long way. You can see that from 1994, we start to trend upwards in terms of people, the percentage of the population earning more. This is in US dollars, purchasing power parity terms, maybe multiplied by 7 or 8 if you want the rand equivalent. The curve, as has been mentioned, really needs to be steeper. Aside from any issues of social justice, that's to manage the risk of social discontent actually growing into actual unrest, as we've seen in North Africa most recently. It's a question of good governance, which needs to come from both the public and the private sector. You have got a forecast here, which is pretty much on trend. As I said, the slope does need to increase significantly. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to comment on the outlook for unemployment and job creation. I'm sure that's going to be much of the focus of our discussion during the course of today. But in preparing for this morning, I couldn't help but remember this old poster from 1981. I don't know how many of you remember it too. It was to commemorate 20 years of the Republic. It's now 50 years that South Africa has been a republic. And before I take your questions, I leave you with this one. Has the slice really gotten much larger yet?